Hello, my name is GiBi from the Horror Homestead, and this is the first video in a series discussing the Fazbear Frights series of Five Nights at Freddy's novels. I'm going to start with an introduction to the series, and then spend the rest of this video talking about Into the Pit. The Fazbear Frights book series was announced in November of 2018, 5 months after the release of UCN and the final Silver Eyes novel, The Fourth Closet, and 6 months before the release of Help Wanted in May 2019. It would take over a year for Into the Pit, the first Fazbear Frights novel, to actually release in December of 2019. This was now after Help Wanted, but 2 years before Security Breach. Each physical book is a collection of 3 unrelated short stories, as well as an epilogue, which fit together as chapters in a longer connected story across each of the books. These epilogues have been dubbed the Stitch Wraith Stingers. A stinger is typically a short scene at the end of a work, think the post-credit scenes in Marvel movies, and the Stitch Wraith is the central figure discussed throughout these epilogues. The physical books themselves are titled the same as one of the stories contained within the books. So, Into the Pit contains Into the Pit, To Be Beautiful, and Count the Ways. It was recently revealed in an interview that Scott came up with all the story ideas for the books. He would write 10-page outlines, and other authors, like Ellie Cooper, fleshed them out into the 50-ish page stories that we ended up with. So it's Scott's story with Ellie's details and prose. We also learned recently that Scott kept a lot of details to himself while Steel Wool was making Security Breach, to the point that the final game had story elements that contradicted what Scott intended. I think it's possible that similar things happened with these stories. Many details in these books were almost certainly the real author's additions that might not have been important to Scott, or might not have been things that Scott noticed were contradictions. For that reason, I think that hunting for lore in these stories kind of misses the point. Discussing this series is going to be a long ordeal, so I've decided to structure it this way. I'm reading each story 3 times. I do a read-through once, making notes in a black pen, then again immediately making notes in red pen, then I move on to the next story. I repeat this process, finish the entire physical book, and then I make notes on my third read-through in blue pen. Then I write this script, and then move on to the next book. After finishing all the books using this method, I'm going to do one last look over at how the earlier stories are impacted by the later stories. For full transparency, I'm going into the series already knowing some very important details, like that Eleanor will be a reoccurring character. This video is going to try to serve 3 functions. 1. Summarize the events of the story. Pretty straightforward. 2. Analyze the story. By this I mean reading through and annotating the book like it's a Shakespeare play in an English 201 college course, talking about themes and imagery and coming to wild conclusions. And finally, stating what the story has to do with the FNAF lore. You might think that that's the most important part of each story, but I actually think it's the least important. I, writing this at the beginning of my journey, am a believer in Frights Fiction, a fan theory that the Fazbear Frights books are in-universe horror books published by Fazbear LLC. In Help Wanted, we saw that after the events of Pizzeria Simulator, Fazbear Entertainment was reincorporated as Fazbear LLC. It hired an indie dev to make a horror game about the events that happened decades ago at Freddy's locations. They then covered this up by releasing their own VR game along the lines of these fictional games. The indie games discussed in Help Wanted are not the first 6 FNAF games. The first 6 FNAF games are still canon and still actually happened. But in universe, somebody made 3 similar games depicting the events of FNAF 1, 2, and 3. The company then made a VR game recreating those 3 fictional games. They do this so that they can claim that the events of FNAFs 1 through 6 are just urban legends. Basically, they're trying to cover up what actually happened by presenting fictional versions of those events. This kind of thing does have precedent in other mediums and art forms. So even though it's a little confusing, I think there are some examples that could help clear it up. In 1940, DC started publishing The Flash as an ongoing comic series starring Jay Garrick. By 1956, DC had decided to reboot their comic universe, introducing Barry Allen as the Flash. In Barry's debut issue, he reads the Jay Garrick Flash series, and when he obtains his super speedy powers, he decides to be a hero, and he calls himself the Flash, after this fictional character. His adventures then continue in The Flash issue 105. So the first 104 issues of The Flash are retconned to be in-universe books that Barry Allen read. In 2010, a remake of The Karate Kid was released, starring Jackie Chan and Jaden Smith. Originally, it was written, made, and released as a remake. But in 2025, a new Karate Kid movie, following the chronology of the original film series, revealed that the 2010 remake is actually an in-universe movie based on the actual events of the characters. In both of these cases, the media that was produced for you, a real person to consume, was retconned to be an in-universe piece of media that the characters are aware of. The piece is thus canon, as it exists within the overall story, but the events depicted are not true. Frights Fiction, the fan theory, is that the book series Fazbear Frights is the same kind of in-universe fiction as the 2010 Karate Kid or the first 100 or so issues of The Flash. Gregory from Security Breach could have been sitting in class with his Freddy's obsessed friends reading Into the Pit, a book published by Fazbear LLC, the same company that released Help Wanted and owns the Pizzaplex. The same is not true of the Silver Eyes trilogy. So going through these stories, I'm not going to be adding these events to a coherent timeline of the story. I'm not adding a time-traveling ball pit and the protagonist Oswald to the story of FNAF. But I am adding the publishing of these books to the timeline. While reading these stories, what we're looking for is evidence of Frights Fiction, possible counter-evidence to Frights Fiction, and any information we might be able to get about the in-universe author of these stories. For example, in Into the Pit, the antagonist is a yellow Bonnie mascot, killing children. An in-universe FNAF character would easily be able to write those details, given that we know the security cameras picked up William in his spring Bonnie suit, luring kids to the back room for the MCI. 30 years later, this would be public knowledge, and somebody tasked with writing a fictional book about these events would know to use the yellow bunny killer. So once again, the format of these videos will be summary, analysis, Frights Fiction details. After I conclude talking about all the stories, I'm going to re-examine whether Frights Fiction holds up. So now, let's actually begin. Into the Pit. The back cover of the book Into the Pit asks, "What do you wish for most?" It's a question that Oswald, Sarah, and Millie think they know the answer to. Oswald wishes his summer wasn't so boring, Sarah wishes to be beautiful, and Millie wishes she could just disappear from the face of the earth. But in the twisted world of Five Nights at Freddy's, their heart's deepest desires have an unexpected cost. This statement is supposedly the theme of the 3 stories contained within this book. Basically, it's be careful what you wish for. Let's examine Into the Pit, the story, and see what Oswald wishes for, and then what happens as a result of that wish, and explore whether or not that's actually the theme of this short story, or whether that's something that was added on to the back of the book for marketing purposes. Oswald is 10 years old and lives in a boring old town. On a car ride with his dad, he spots a dead possum that's been roadkill for multiple days. Despite being dead, the possum is still there. The book specifically uses the phrase furry corpse to refer to its body. Oswald's dad says, "Nothing looks deader than a dead possum." And Oswald responds, "Except this town." They pass store windows of closed shops displaying nothing but dust. The town's mill closed, and so lots of people have moved away. Oswald's father had to get a worse job, and his family is struggling now. Oswald's best friend Ben moved away too, so now he's all alone. Oswald watched the town die. Oswald's dad asked him if he's excited for the last day of school, and Oswald thinks that this is a nothing question that his dad doesn't actually want to hear the answer to, equating it to one of those questions adults always ask, like if their child brushed their teeth. Oswald arrives at school and runs into his bully, a kid named Dylan, who mocks him by calling Oswald the Ocelot. Oswald the Ocelot was apparently a pink cartoon ocelot on one of the little kid channels. I cannot confirm, but I'm pretty sure, I'm 99% sure, this is a reference to Oswald the Octopus from Nick Jr. That's actually a show that I grew up watching, and I'm interested in the fact that it's in this FNAF novel. That one never gets old, does it? Oswald walked past Dylan and was relieved when his tormentor chose not to follow him. So Oswald draws in his notebook during his last day, and the book says he's drawing this weird image of bears and birds and bunnies. But they're animatronics. I wonder where this is going. Even after finishing the story, there's not actually a reason given as to why Oswald has the notion to draw what is very obviously the Freddy's cast of characters minus Foxy. It's implied that the story takes place in the mid-2010s, so it would be after the heyday of Freddy's but before the Pizzaplex. There is never any reason given for this, like, psychic connection to Freddy's, that he starts drawing Freddy's characters right before he meets Freddy's characters. Oswald's teacher turns on a childish movie about talking barn animals. The book does not specify if this is Charlotte's Web, or Babe, or Barnyard. The book's discussion of copyrighted real-world IPs is an interesting topic that we're going to delve into later, but for now we should just note that the farm movie is not specified one way or the other what movie it is. So Oswald goes home and his dad makes dinner, mac and cheese and corn. It was a very yellow meal. Yellow. Like spring bonnie? Oswald's mom works from noon to midnight, so she's never the one making dinner. At dinner, Oswald's dad broaches the topic of Oswald being more independent this summer, suggesting that he drive him into town in the mornings and then Oswald can hang out at the library or at Jeff's Pizza until his dad's done at work at 3. Jeff's Pizza is very clearly an old Freddy's location. Oswald points out how it has a stage, but they don't even have a karaoke machine, so what's that for? It's also just as rundown as the town. That night, they watch an old Japanese monster movie called Zendrillix vs. Mechazendrillix. While the farm movie just avoided saying the title outright, the book now creates a fictionalized version of what is obviously Godzilla and Mechagodzilla. It's not uncommon for books and movies to make fictional parodies of real things, but as we'll see later, this is very inconsistent within Into the Pit. What gets avoided entirely, what gets mentioned, what's a real piece of media, what gets a fake title like Zendrillix, there's a lot of contradictions and we'll actually examine those at the end. Godzilla, or Zendrillix and Mechazendrillix, are inherently contrasted to the Freddy's characters. One is a robot, like an endoskeleton, and Oswald prefers the real Zendrillix, the one who is not just an endoskeleton. Quote, even though he was just a guy in a rubber suit, somehow he managed to have a lot of personality. This is talking about the Godzilla character. That night, Oswald lies in bed, worried about how boring his summer will be. Right before a page break, he thinks to himself, please, let something interesting happen. This is his wish, the wish that's mentioned on the back cover. He wants something interesting to happen this summer. The next morning, Oswald drinks orange juice because he can only consume orange and yellow food. His mom brings up his best friend Ben, who moved away, and he almost cries. His mom says that maybe somebody new will move into town and he can make friends, but then Oswald says, why would a new family move here? And yeah, she's like, yeah, that's true, because the town's dying. If there's one thing we know about the town, it's that it's dying. I'm gonna have to bring this up again later because it's gonna be contradicted. Oswald goes to the library, he reads a science fiction manga, and sees adults at the computers, and the book implies that these are homeless people on meth. I am not joking. He goes to Jeff's Pizza, and he notes again that there is a stage, and also that there is a mural that's been covered up by yellow paint. The mural obviously being of the Freddy's gang. But now, their legacy has been covered up by yellow. Like Spring Bonnie. There's a ball pit in the corner, it's surrounded by yellow rope to keep people out. The only employee in the restaurant is Jeff, so Oswald orders a cheese slice and a orange soda, because orange and yellow foods. and he pulls out his library book, which is a manga about a world where kids with secret powers went to a special school to learn how to fight evil. There's no date associated with the story. It was published in 2019, but so far it could have taken place any year after the invention of tablets, because they mentioned tablets. So it's definitely the 2010s. If this manga is supposed to be My Hero Academia, which it very clearly is, then that puts it after the year 2014. 2 hours later, Jeff gives Oswald some free pizza and then his dad picks him up. Fast forward a couple of weeks. It is now Family Fun Night, a night that Oswald's family sets aside to do fun things together. He mentions going skating or bowling and how his parents used to hold his hand to help him skate better. But now they have no money, so they just do things at home, like rent a movie from Redbox. It's just a weird time capsule of a thing because Redbox went out of business in July of 2024. Even before that, streaming was just so much more popular. I don't know why Oswald doesn't have Netflix. The next section is the most annoying part of the entire story. They start to watch a remake of an old science fiction movie. Once the movie was over, Dad said, "Well, that was pretty good, but not as good as the real version." "What do you mean, the real version?" Oswald said. "That was the real version." "Not really," Dad said. "I mean, it was set in the same universe as the real version, but it was kind of a cheap knockoff of the one that came out when I was a kid." This discourse is about to get wild, y'all. Okay, so it's a sci-fi movie that is a remake of a movie from when Oswald's dad was a kid, and it's stated later that his father remembers the MCI. He was a little older than 14 during the MCI, which was 1985, so he's probably born in the early 70s, actually. So a science fiction movie from the 70s or 80s, most movies from that era, but the dad does say it's set in the same universe as the original movie. This statement's interesting because it's the exact kind of language that is used to discuss the Fazbear Frights and the Tales from the Pizzaplex novels. Obviously, when this was first written, that was not the case. It was not the discourse that people were discussing whether it being in the same world as the games actually means it's in the same continuity, but it's possible. So it's a legacy sequel that is basically a remake. They're watching The Force Awakens. FNAF has entered into the murky waters of sequel trilogy discourse. So yeah, they're watching Star Wars, which also sets the story in 2016 at the earliest, because that's when The Force Awakens would have been available on DVD and Blu-ray. There's a weird line break in the middle of the paragraph. I think this is just an editing mistake. This is not the first printing of the book, it's actually from the box set, so it's theoretically the most recent printing of the book. So I don't know why this editing mistake is here. I know this sounds like I'm harping on the topic. It does become important later. One morning, Dad is driving Oswald into town, and there's a song on the radio that Oswald doesn't like. It was some stupid song about a tractor. There's lots of stupid songs about tractors. There's Big Green Tractor. She Thinks My Tractor's Sexy. International Harvester. Once again, the book is unwilling to name something, but just hints at a thing that does actually exist. So far, that list includes Barnyard, My Hero Academia, Star Wars The Force Awakens, and one of the tractor songs. Fun fact, Big Green Tractor and She Thinks My Tractor's Sexy were actually written by the same guy. "I was out bush hogging on my farm one night and I had the lights on. It was about 8 o'clock and I was driving along in this field. I was cleaning up this fence row and just started singing this melody and then this chorus driving this big green tractor I was on. I was singing just little bits and pieces. The next day I was writing with Jim Collins, who had written She Thinks My Tractor's Sexy for Kenny Chesney. I walked in there and asked if he'd be willing to tackle another tractor song, and he said, yeah." David Lee Murphy. The places that researching FNAF takes me are... I swear to God, wild. Dad apparently calls Oswald Oz. This is important because of isekais. According to a Twitter poll I ran, most of my audience does not know what an isekai is. Isekai is a Japanese term that means another world. It is the type of story in which the main characters are transported into another world. It has a lot of fish out of water archetypes. It's typically science fiction or fantasy. It's Narnia. It's The Wizard of Oz. It's Alice in Wonderland. It's Spirited Away. It's a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. It's the Super Mario Bros. Movie. It's Dante's Divine Comedy. It's Digimon Adventures. It's Five Nights at Freddy's Into the Pit. There are some stories that people would call isekai adjacent that some people might put into the genre and some people might not. For example, Back to the Future. It's structured the exact same way as something like Alice in Wonderland or Narnia. He enters into a different world where he's a fish out of water. He wants to get back home. At the end, he does get back home. It just so happens to be his past as opposed to a magical fantasy realm. So I think Oswald's nickname being Oz as an allusion to the Wizard of Oz, possibly the most famous Isekai story in this story, which will eventually go on to be an Isekai, as we will see later, is not unintentional. Alright, so Oz is at Jeff's Pizza. The ball pit is described as dusty, like how the town was described as dusty earlier. He decides to hide in the ball pit while waiting for his dad to pick him up because he's mad at his dad for being cheap and for not wanting to move away and get a better job. He takes off his shoes for some reason and hides in the ball pit. He then gets bored, sneezes because of the dust, comes up, and is now inside of a bustling arcade. He's at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in 1985. It took a few seconds for his eyes to adjust from the darkness of the pit to the brightness that now surrounded him. The flashing lights and vivid colors. He looked around and muttered, "Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. Not so crazy now, am I? Even the book is comparing itself to isekais. Speaking of crazy, this next part of the story drives me crazy. The walls were lined with shiny arcade cabinets housing games he had heard his dad talk about from his own childhood. Miss Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Frogger, Q*bert, Galaga. A neon-lighted claw machine displayed plush blue elf creatures and orange cartoon cats. So the book can't name Barnyard, Tractor Song, Smurfs, or Garfield. They have to make up their own Godzilla, but they can say Miss Pac-Man and Donkey Kong? What, it's almost like this book was published by, like, a company that is an arcade and that sells video games and would be okay with advertising games that you could play at arcade locations like a Mega Pizzaplex or something. I don't know, man. That's right, my biggest piece of evidence for Frights Fiction so far is that the book is allowed to name real video arcade games, but not other types of media. This is Fazbear Fiction Frights evidence right here. Evidence number one, copyright infringement. So Oswald walks around the arcade and notices girls with big hair, because it's the 80s. And they mention a brown bear, blue rabbit, and bird girl on stage. So it's Blue Rabbit, so not Spring Bonnie. Regular Freddy. But whenever Chica's mentioned, it says bird girl, not yellow bird. Probably because later in the narrative, when they want to say yellow animatronic or yellow thing, they want it specifically to only be Spring Bonnie. So they don't even want to tell you that Chica is yellow. So they call her a girl. Reading this now, I'm wondering if all of the animatronics were originally yellow. Spring Bonnie, Fredbear, and as far as we know, Chica is the earliest version of Chica. There are other versions. Funtime Chica is white. I think Glamrock Chica is white, but original OG Chica is yellow. So all three original versions of those three main animatronics were yellow. Fredbear turned brown at some point. Bonnie turned blue at some point. Chica turned white at some point. I don't know what this means, but it's there. Oz runs into a guy named Chip, a kid wearing a yellow polo shirt. This instance of yellow doesn't seem to mean anything, which is kind of disappointing. Chip introduces his tall black friend Mike, because if there's one thing we need in this franchise, it's another character named Mike. Maybe that's why it specifies that he's black, so we don't think that it's Michael Afton. Chip also refers to the restaurant as Freddy's. They go and they play a game and they pass an employee in a yellow rabbit suit, but nobody pays any mind to him. Oz gets worried that his dad will be looking for him if he stays too long in the past, which, like maybe, we don't know how time works. He becomes aware that he's missing his shoes, like Dorothy, who needs ruby slippers to get home. He climbs into the ball pit, returns to his own time, and it seems like no time has passed. His dad picks him up, and then he goes back to Jeff's Pizza the next day. He travels through time, and he notices a calendar marked 1985. He then runs into Chip and Mike again. Mike is wearing a Back to the Future shirt, and he calls Oswald Oz, like the Wizard of Oz. Now, the book is just calling out this fact. So now the book can name real movies like Back to the Future and the Wizard of Oz, but not Star Wars for some reason. Obviously, Back to the Future is one of those maybe isekai stories. It's about time travel, and this is very much similar in style to that same kind of time travel story. So again, I think it's just trying to draw parallels and connection between these other famous isekais. His friend asked him, "Hey, does anyone call you Oz?" And Oz says, "They do now." This is weird, because his dad calls him Oz, so it's not like these kids are the first people to call him Oz. I think that this was a mistake that could have been taken out in a rewrite or another draft. So they go to eat pizza, they pass the yellow rabbit again, the rabbit is standing in the corner, and Oz once again notes that it looks like nobody else can see the rabbit. They hang out, Oz goes back to the next day, they're all just chilling, they're being friends. Chip mentioned that he likes the movie The Eternal Song, and Mike says, "That movie was so boring. I was like, The Eternal Song is the perfect title for this movie because I don't think it's ever going to end." So they can say Back to the Future. They can't say Star Wars. They make up Zendrillix instead of Godzilla, and now they have to make up The Eternal Song instead of The Never-Ending Story, which is clearly what this is supposed to be. I don't get it. Oz has never seen most of the 80s movies that they talk about, but he mentions that he likes E.T., so E.T. is a movie that they can say for some reason. The book also states that Oz doesn't think he can physically leave the pizzeria because of time travel stuff. Oz feels guilty about Chip and Mike paying for everything at the pizzeria, and then he feels Freddy's tokens magically appear in his pocket. So it's not just time travel, there's some amount of wish fulfillment magic going on. It makes you wonder if Chip and Mike being friendly is also just a force of this magical wish power that's going on. Maybe those kids would not have normally been as nice to a nerdy kid like Oswald if it wasn't for this ability for the ball pit to grant whatever wish he's looking for. The next day, Oz is talking to his dad and asks how old he was in 1985. Dad starts talking about baseball and going to the arcade when he was a kid, which of course tells us that he would have been going to Freddy's at this time period. Oz calls him on this, and says he's been doing research into Freddy's, and says that it closed down a long time ago. And Dad's like, "Yeah, it closed." They get to the library, and the book says, maybe it was Oswald's imagination, but it seemed like Dad was relieved to get to their destination so he wouldn't have to answer any more of his questions. So the dad obviously didn't want to get into the dead children that will be murdered there in 1985, or were murdered there in 1985, I guess. Which is weird, because I figured that if Oswald was to actually research Freddy's, the first thing that would pop up would probably be that it closed down because of the murders. On the fourth day that Oswald goes to Freddy's, or the fifth day that we see him at Jeff's, although keep in mind there's been multiple weeks between him going there, he enters into the ball pit, and he appears in the midst of chaos. In the games, in other FNAF media like the Silver Eyes trilogy and the movie, the MCI is the Missing Children's Incident. William kills about 5 kids over the course of multiple days, and hides their bodies within the animatronics. The bodies are never found, and so it's just that kids went missing at Freddy's. There's security camera footage that shows somebody in the yellow Bonnie costume leading people into the back room, so they know it was the yellow Bonnie costume, but they can't necessarily pin it on William. What we're about to see is way different. Oswald looks for Mike and Chip, but can't find them. He sees the yellow rabbit entering a private room. He follows. He thinks that for some reason he can't be hurt before he's born. The book calls attention to Oswald following the rabbit as an allusion to Alice in Wonderland, another famous Isekai. The rabbit beckons Oswald into the party room, and he enters, seeing 6 dead children leaning against the wall, all wearing birthday hats. Obviously, in the original story, William did kill 6 kids, with Charlie being the 6th. But in the games and the movies and the whatevers, she is usually not lumped in with the MCI. Unclear what's going on here. Maybe there's an answer for it. In the Frights Fiction theory, I'll talk about that later. I think it's important to note that Oswald's dad did not want to talk to Oswald about the murders, but the rabbit specifically leads him to the scene of all of the dead kids to show him what happened. I'm going to discuss later about all of the mirrors between the father and the rabbit, but this is a good time to mention that there will be a lot of opposites going forward. The book mentions that the rabbit has blank eyes, which is not true of the cover art of the book where he has very bright blue eyes, and it's also not true of the Silver Eyes graphic novel in which his eyes are gray. The rabbit lunges at Oswald. The book goes out of its way to mention that Oswald doesn't know how the kids were killed, so it's obvious that he's not just like wielding a knife. Oswald runs and hides in the ball pit. When he emerges, he is back in the future, and his dad is angrily looking for him at Jeff's Pizza. His dad goes to grab him out of the ball pit, and then a pair of yellow arms reached out of the pit and pulled Dad under. I love the title inversion here. Oswald goes into the pit. The rabbit comes out of the pit to grab the dad. Oswald's going to the past, the rabbit's coming into the future. It's just a good use of the term. I like it. It's also another interesting use of the difference between how time passes in the past and in the present, because Oswald's only there for a couple of minutes, but seemingly hours have passed, whereas other times he's there for hours, but seemingly only seconds passed. so it seems like the pit does whatever's needed to do for the story to continue. The rabbit drags Dad under the balls, and then emerges from the pit. It straightens its bow tie, grabs Oswald, and takes him out of the restaurant. Jeff doesn't seem to notice that a giant bunny is leading Oswald away. It basically says that everybody just sees the rabbit as Oswald's dad. The rabbit drives Oswald home, and when they park, Oswald jumps out of the car, but the rabbit has teleported to stand in front of him. It grabs his arm and brings him inside. The rabbit also can't speak. Oswald locks himself in his room with Jinx, his cat, who had angrily hissed at the rabbit, and he texts his mother to come home. Mom comes home from work early. Oswald tells her that he's worried about Dad, but Mom sees the rabbit as his dad. She says, "Oswald, I just saw your dad. He's lying on the bed in our bedroom watching TV. He made you a chicken pot pie for dinner. It's sitting on the stove." Ah yes, so Dad made food that isn't just something you boil. Very interesting. That seems like undadly behavior. It seems like the rabbit doesn't behave the way that Dad did. Oswald gets up the next morning, eats breakfast with his mom and with the rabbit. There's no indication from anyone besides Oswald that this is weird. He prepares for his first day of school and brushes his teeth, but the rabbit never asks Oswald if he brushed his teeth. You'll remember from earlier, Oswald thought to himself that parents always ask questions like if their kid brushed their teeth. So once again, it's another instance that the rabbit is not his father. The rabbit takes Oswald to school. The text keeps referring to it as the big yellow thing, and Oswald tells the rabbit that he's going to take the bus home, so not to worry. Dylan, the school bully, starts to pick on Oswald again. While I'm sure that the name Oswald was picked because it can be abbreviated as Oz, it's also notable that there's a famous cartoon rabbit in the real world named Oswald. Oswald considers going to the police, but recognizes that whatever magic is going on that leads to people seeing the rabbit as his dad would just lead the police to see the rabbit as his dad, and he would be deemed crazy. At recess, a new girl comes and sits next to him. They introduce themselves. It's weird because the book has been so firm in saying that the town is dying, that people are moving away, that no one's moving to town, and yet this girl moves to town. Earlier, the mom said maybe someone new will move in. Oswald says no they won't, and the mom goes, oh well maybe you'll meet somebody who's been here all along that you just haven't met yet. And now a girl's moved in. Why? At first I thought that she was part of the strange magic of whatever's going on here. Now I think it's either an author oversight or it's related to the theme, which I'm going to talk about more later. The girl is reading a book about Greek mythology. Oswald feels kind of dumb for not knowing about that kind of thing. The girl says, I read it when I need to be brave. Discussing mythology is a catalyst for multiple actions and thoughts that the main characters in all three of the stories in this physical book have. It's an ongoing running theme, so I'm going to discuss that later when it comes up in the other stories. The girl says she needs to be brave because she's the new kid in school and just moved to town. Oswald offers to be her friend. Her name is Gabrielle, which is very close to Gabriel, the name of one of the MCI kids in the games. Then again, Scott has said that he has to go through so many names for all the different stories that most of the time them lining up in ways like that is just a coincidence. But it's also the first book, so maybe it's not. You can read into Gabrielle's family moving to the town as almost the town healing. If there's a parallel between the town dying and Freddy's closing, then it would be interesting if now the town is healing while Freddy's is being reborn, unnaturally reborn, brought back from the dead. If whatever Oswald did in the pit that has now led to the Yellow Rabbit coming back to this reemergence of Freddy's in the real world, I guess, because keep in mind, no matter what, this book takes place after FNAF 6. Fazbear Entertainment is back. The Pizzaplex is a couple years away from being opened. So, for whatever reason, it seems like there's a legacy of Freddy's that is also tied to this town. And now with the reemergence of Freddy's, it's possible that this evidence is pointing to a reemergence of the town. Oswald goes home. The rabbit is vacuuming the living room, probably getting rid of dust bunnies. Oswald starts to clean the house too. He dusts off the coffee table, a lamp, etc. The specific mention of dusting the house is once again interesting because it invites comparisons to the town being revitalized. The town is described as dusty. Oswald is now dusting and removing the dust. Oswald is the one who went into the ball pit. Oswald is the one who has now rejuvenated Freddy's. The town is rejuvenating as evidenced by Gabrielle moving to town. Again, all these things seem to be connected through imagery within the book. For dinner, the rabbit makes frozen pizza and fruit punch. So Oswald does, in fact, sometimes consume things that are not yellow or orange. He drank red fruit punch. The rabbit does not eat dinner, and Oswald wonders if the rabbit can eat anything. Oswald figures that his dad might be trapped in 1985, so he plots to sneak back into the pit. He waits until dark, and then waited some more. He sneaks past his parents' bedroom and sees the rabbit sleeping in his dad's bed. He goes outside and sees kids riding their bikes. He runs to Jeff's Pizza, and it's still open. It's now a long time after dark. It also took Oswald time to get to Jeff's Pizza. It's also the summer, so the darkness comes in even later in the day than it would in other parts of the year, so I am unsure what time it is. It just seems like it would have to be really late for it to be dark, and then after dark, and then him to run into town. Oswald distracts Jeff by ordering a soda, goes into the pit, finds his dad back in time, unconscious in the ball pit, and then tries to save him. This is possibly an allusion to multiple things, and I think it's thematically relevant to the book. The first thing I think of is Persephone from Greek mythology, because Greek mythology was brought up earlier. Persephone was kidnapped and brought to the underworld, and then she had to be saved. There's a lot of stories like that throughout all of fiction and mythology, whether it's Dr. Doom trying to save his mother from the afterlife, Hercules has to go down to defeat Cerberus. Percy Jackson has to play fetch with Cerberus or something, I don't know. If we're specifically talking about sons and fathers and the son rescuing the father, then there's a great example of Pinocchio. Geppetto gets swallowed by the whale and Pinocchio has to go in afterward and save him. Likewise, Luke Skywalker has to purposefully be captured and enter the Death Star to metaphysically save his father. The idea where you have to venture into the underworld to save somebody is an ancient story, and I think that that's why Greek mythology was mentioned earlier, as a setup to this. I'm going to talk about this more during the theme section of the book. The book actually says he had to save his dad, like those ancient Greek heroes Gabrielle had told him about. Oswald rescues his father. He's also probably rescuing the town. We'll get back to that. Oswald lifts his dad out of the pit and into the present-day Jeff's Pizza. The rabbit is there. It attacks Oswald. Oswald punches it. They scuffle. It grabs Oswald and unhinges its jaw, revealing sharp teeth. At this point, I need to ask why a Springlock suit would have sharp teeth. It makes me think that this is more like one of the Nightmare animatronics, something that was actually built to be evil, or a monster manifestation of the essence of William in his Springtrap suit, as opposed to an actual Springlock suit. If that's the case, then I find the mentions of him at Freddy's earlier in the story a lot more interesting. So the rabbit bites Oswald's arm, Oswald manages to get him all tangled up in the rope, and the rabbit gets hanged by accident. It starts squirming in pain. Its stare, still terrifying in its blankness, was aimed in Oswald's direction, as if it were asking him for help. Oswald certainly wasn't going to rescue it. Once again, I pointed out parallels between the bunny and Oswald's father. Oswald rescued his father, but he's not going to rescue the rabbit, which is this dark mirror of his father. After the rabbit suit, it just turns into the suit. The body that was inside of it piloting it is just gone. It's now just an empty suit. Dad wakes up. He doesn't remember any of this. He's probably going to be very confused because he lost a day of his life. And the book says, his son led him to the exit of the ball pit. Again, the son is helping the father escape the pit. Hades. He sees the hanging yellow costume, meaning that it's real, the dad can see it now, and they both leave. They tell each other that they love each other, and Jeff calls after them, saying that Oswald forgot his soda. Ba-ba-da-ba-da-da. And that's the end of the story. For now, these events will be referenced later on in the series, specifically in the Stitch Wraith Stingers. So now I want to talk about the themes and stuff, because I am the Yap Master. The Spring Bonnie suit is a callback to the dead possum in the beginning of the story. A furry corpse, still here. It is somehow more dead than dead. The town is dying, Freddy's closed, but now its memory is coming back, and so the town is also having this weird resurgence where Gabrielle and her family moves to town. I talked about all that stuff. The book makes references to isekais like Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz explicitly, as well as stories like Back to the Future, which makes me think that those isekai elements in this book and the comparisons to them are intentional. Now is where I lose people, because I'm going to start taking this book way too seriously. I'm gonna take out my inner English teacher, ignoring FNAF lore, taking away the fact that this book is titled Five Nights at Freddy's. If I was just given this in a vacuum with no prior knowledge, I would write that Spring Bonnie is a metaphor for child abuse. Can't wait for that to be in an out-of-context GiBi video compilation. I'm now going to read a list of quotes from the book, and again, I want you to think of this out of context of Five Nights at Freddy's. My take is that Oswald's dad is, in reality, changed as a person as a result of losing his job and not being able to provide for his family, etc. And maybe now he's an alcoholic or something. So I'm going to read these quotes, and I want you to ask yourself if they'd be at home in a story about a young kid whose alcoholic father is scaring him. The rabbit is going to be his father when he's having those mood swings. He's being too rough, he's yelling, he's abusive, etc. And the child is being gaslit by his community. So again, I'm going to read these quotes. I want you to think of them in that light. The rabbit was beside him, its arm firmly around Oswald's shoulders, guiding him toward the exit. Oswald looked at Jeff, who stood behind the counter. Maybe Jeff would help him? But Jeff wore the same hangdog expression he always wore, and just said, "See you guys later." How could Jeff, how could anyone, act like the situation was normal? It opened the passenger door of Dad's car and pushed Oswald in. This is a kidnapping or something. My mom will be home soon and she'll call the police." Oswald could hear the bunny outside his door. If he made a phone call, it would hear him, but maybe he could send a text. These examples so far depict a new strange feeling of uncomfortableness around his father, who is now acting more rough with him than usual, as well as the implication that he's not allowed to reach out and talk to other adults about it without repercussions. "Oswald, you need to tell me what's going on." Mom's brow was furrowed with worry. Where to start? How to explain without sounding crazy? "It's Dad. He's not okay. I'm not even sure where he is." Mom put her hand on both his shoulders. "Oswald, I just saw your dad. He's lying on the bed in our bedroom watching TV." "I'm okay," Oswald said. "I mean, if Dad's okay, I'm okay. He just didn't seem okay." But if Dad was okay, it meant Oswald hadn't been seeing what he thought he saw, and that must mean that Oswald was losing his mind. The crossing guard and the kids at the crosswalk didn't seem to notice that the car was being driven by a giant yellow rabbit. I was the only person who could see it wasn't you. Even Mom thought it was you. These examples exhibit the internal struggle Oswald feels, where his father is only acting out around him and not when other adults, including his mother, are present. Because people continue to treat his father as normal, Oswald has to second-guess whether his own perceptions of reality are accurate. Basically, he's being gaslit. "Give it a rest, Dylan," Oswald said, pushing past him. "I've got way bigger problems than you today." It was impossible to concentrate in class. Usually, Oswald was a pretty decent student, but how could he focus with his life and possibly his sanity falling apart? Maybe he should talk to someone. The school counselor or the school police officer, but he knew anything that came out of his mouth would sound dangerously crazy. How could he convince a police officer that his dad was missing if everyone who looked at the yellow thing saw Oswald's dad? These show the exact kind of behaviors and warning signs that teachers will look for in students who have difficult home lives. Suddenly their grades are slipping, they're lashing out against classmates. Oswald also feels like none of the adults will believe him, because if his father, the main adult in his life, is the one hurting him, how is he supposed to trust another adult? He was trying to figure out how to do battle with a monster, a yellow, long-eared monster, in his own home. It was hard calling this thing Dad, but he managed. This specifically draws attention to the duality of his dad, and the fact that he has to cope by convincing himself that there is some sort of monster inside of him. It's not Dad, it's this thing, which of course throughout the story would be personified by the yellow rabbit. In this reading, Bonnie would be how Oswald copes with his father's dark side. The story ends with Oswald saving his father from this entity, from these behaviors, and then the two reconciling. Do I think that's what Scott intended? No, but that's because this is a FNAF book. If I was given this story again with no context as an English major, then yeah, I'd read a story about how the bunny is a metaphor for child abuse. How Oswald gets lost in fantasy worlds similar to Oz or Wonderland or Narnia to cope. I'm going to be doing annoying stuff like this for all the stories, so you're going to have to bear with me. Or rabbit with me. Okay, so now to answer the question that is technically the thesis to this entire project. How does this story fit in with Frights Fiction, the fan theory? The theory is that this is an in-universe book published by the Pizzaplex, the Help Wanted era of Fazbear Entertainment. Well, In 1985, the yellow thing is not seen by the adults, so Freddy's is not liable for not stopping him. He's not a guy, he's not an employee, he's not a founder, he's a horror slasher monster who cannot be seen. The memory of Freddy's helps to revitalize the town. It shows that Freddy's is important. Reading the book will make kids hungry for pizza and soda. The book talks about how cool arcades are. Freddy's is shown to be a cool place to go. The MCI is just wrong compared to the canon events of the games. 6 victims at once, when the arcade is open, the body's just lying out, etc. It's a similar thing, but the actual events aren't the same. Like how the Scream movies are based on real-world murders, but it's changed just enough for the fictional murders that the real-life victims aren't going to get upset. I think. I don't know, I didn't ask them. The book publisher can use video game titles like Pac-Man, but has to make up their own titles for, like, The Eternal Song, because advertising these arcade video games brings people to arcades, or because the publisher has deals with the video game companies so that they can use their names in their book. They can mention E.T. because of the famous E.T. Atari game. That's all I got. There's no contradictions to Frights Fiction in this book that I could find. We'll see if there are going to be in future titles. But that's about all I have to say about Into the Pit right now. I'll be revisiting this later when its events are brought up in the Citraith Stingers and other stories, but this was Into the Pit, the short story. The game Into the Pit is very different, and I will be talking about it later. Thank you for watching. It's been a crazy week. Obviously, Into the Pit game coverage will be coming out shortly. I hope that you watch this video first for context. It'll be a little while before I can make To Be Beautiful, because I've been hammering out so many videos this week for FNAF week. I wanted to get this video out before the Into the Pit game. While you're waiting for that, maybe you can watch my too long FNAF video again. You know, there's an Easter egg hidden in that video that no one's found yet. I hesitate to call it an ARG. It's really just one little Easter egg, one little hint, one little interesting thing. If you are going to look for it, just be aware that there's no phone numbers to call, there's no anything to contact. The entire mystery is solvable entirely on my YouTube channel. And if you do figure it out and you leave a comment under that video or on my Twitter or something, maybe I'll give you a shout out in a video or something, just because I'm surprised it's been this long, 4 million plus views, and nobody has found this secret yet. And if you think you found it, you'll know, trust me. So with that, I'd like to thank my patrons. You can join them by following the link in the description to my Patreon. It would really help me out. Thank you for watching me all week long for FNAF week. It's been incredible. I cannot believe it's been 10 years since Five Nights at Freddy's came out. Wow. And I'll be back soon with gameplay for the Into the Pit game. Thank you to my patrons. Helmar, Nan, Rosebud, Sophie, Thumbgada, M. Hidden, Klaus, Haley, Jinx, Jose M, Jose R, Just That Spark, Lauren, Tanner McColeman, and Jeannie. Remember to be nice to each other in the comments, consider supporting the creators you most admire, and never lose sight of the things that are most important to you. And remember that Freddy's stands for Friendly, Respectful Engagement, Discussion, and Discourse Yields Success.